Well, the issue of xenophobic violence may have taken quite a bit of the time that the two leaders had to talk about why the Nigerian president is here. But a great deal was, of course, devoted to cementing economic relations between the two countries. I'm joined in studio by economic analyst Dr. Peter Karungu, who is from the Wits Business School. Good evening, Dr. Karungu. Thank you very much for your time. We won't get into the whole xenophobic violence stuff because I want us to talk about the issue that we've been talking less about today, and that is economic cooperation between these two giants, the two biggest economies on the continent. But I'm sure you'll agree with a lot of people who say the economic ties or relationship between the two is far, in fact, very far from the ideal.
You are very right and very correct. Safe to say South Africa and Nigeria in totality control 1.1% of the world GDP. In other words, Nigeria is currently sitting on about 400 billion, and we are sitting on also close to that. In actual fact, the fact is, in 2014, Nigeria had a GDP in excess of 500 billion. In South Africa, 2011, we had a GDP of more than 416 billion. We are now sitting on 366. That's a scary number to think about. However, of course, it's affected by the exchange rate. But the truth is, these are the mightiest economies in Africa. The trade among themselves, and this is something that we need to open up to, because our people need to understand why we need to trade among ourselves. The fastest moving economies in the world, Europe, they trade among themselves at a rate of 70% of their trade. In other words, if you factor the trade they do in the world and take the the inter-trade among the European is 70%. In the United States is 50%. In Asia is 60%. In Africa is 15%.
Why is that?
Because first, I think we have too many boundaries, number one. Two, we have so much barrier, and we tend to assume the more you trade, the more you protect yourself, rather than let goods flow for where there is the scope of bigger numbers, the lower the price, the faster the people access goods, the more people consume goods, the higher the economy grows. And those are the fundamentals. Let me come back to Nigeria. Nigeria, of course, is fuel dependent, about 1.980 billion barrels a day. That's huge. That's literally about, give and take, about a fifth of Saudi Arabia. Now, South Africa, we have everything I always say as an economist. What don't we have? We have the two oceans, the best temperatures. We have agriculture. You name any mineral we have. We have diversity, people across the world. There is nothing we don't have. Except, of course, given apartheid, we have skills deficiency, but we can build on it. And it's the high time to do it. So if you imagine we trade with Nigeria, Nigeria has about 200 million people. We are 50. If we trade with them, even at a fraction of free trade, and they consume our goods, the economy in South Africa will start kicking up. Remember what I told you. These countries have potential. 2014, Nigeria grew by 10.5% GDP growth rate. That's an amazing number. South Africa, at best, we could grow 4%. But if we don't wake up to realize in diversity and in together, diversity as we can never be the same people, but we are also working for the same goal, we can surely turn this continent around. But what are the risks? The risks are fundamental. In Nigeria, 52% of the population are below 25. South Africa, we are talking about 44%, 45%, because our population growth rate is not as fast as in Nigeria. If we don't do the issues today, the youth will hold us accountable. They don't hold us accountable. They say we don't have jobs, we don't have the opportunities you had, and therefore they become, with respect, ungovernable. And to me, these are the critical issues. But more important is to understand that we can't afford to have a turnaround of South African economy. We saw it in the last quarter. We had a growth of 0.8%, a positive growth. Insignificant as the numbers, maybe is better than what it was as negative, number one. Number two, we also throw a trade surplus in a very long time, in excess of 4 billion rands trade surplus. All of a sudden, we see people killing one another for whatever reason. And let me tell you something. It's very easy, it's almost impossible to build an investment basket of 100 billion. Negotiating, talking. It takes 5 or 6 images of destruction to lose the 100 billion. And I think we need to wake up to awaken our people that it is not in the interest of you and I or anybody else to have a negative image of South Africa when we are trying to come up from literally a recessionary period to a positive growth.
Now, I'm going to ask my production team to bring up a piece that one of our reporters who was tracking the events has put together to talk about the agreements that were signed today and the conversations that took place between the two countries. But before we do that, I'm going to ask them to bring up a graphic that shows Nigeria's trade with the rest of the big companies, the big countries in the world, including, of course, us. There's that graphic. You look at its trade, the total trade in 2018 with Nigeria. It's first India, then China, the United States, the Netherlands, Spain, the United Kingdom, France, and then South Africa. And that's the picture you're saying needs to change.
Well, two things. If you look at those countries, you can also say two things. One, most of them are petroleum importing countries. And South Africa, on the other hand, could be doing a mix of goods because we have some of the biggest companies, may it be MTN, may it be ShopRite, you name it, we have it there. But this needs to change. You know why? Because it is in the common understanding to say what Americans, former President Ronald Reagan said. In the middle of the midst of the most difficult economic situation he faced when he took over the presidency, he says, this is American made. Why can't black African say we are also the people made? The point I'm alluding to is the following. If you look at the barrier to trade, 80% of our commodities go to Europe, go to China, and then they come back to us with value added. I always talk about cocoa, chocolate. You look at chocolate. You think chocolate comes from Switzerland. They don't grow cocoa anywhere. You talk about coffee. You talk about English breakfast tea. You go to any hotel in the world. There is no tea growing in England. The tea grows in Africa or wherever else it grows. Maybe it could grow in some part of Asia. But technically speaking, it's the high time we start asking ourselves, is it possible to say, I'm proudly doing, eating, buying, consuming? Because in the end, we have a population base that can turn the continent itself. You know what? And you and I discuss this quite often. Economy is driven by 4 factors: the consumption, investment, government, import, export. The biggest driver of the economy is called consumption. If we start buying for our own consumption alone, we could change the event. I think you're going to read a book, which I don't want to give it to you today, that shows how difficult it is for Anglophone countries to deal with respect. And I don't like to use that terminology as an economist. I'm saying those colonies that were under the French and those who were under the British, for instance, trade among them is virtually impossible.
Why?
Because on one hand, the Francophone literally answers to some powers in France. And therefore, the dictums of trade is literally driven from Paris. Everybody knows that, but we don't want to talk about it. So it's very difficult.
But are the Anglophones any different?
I think a little bit. They are more liberal, in my view. I may be wrong, but economists keep on debating this question, but we don't bring it forward the way we are bringing it forward. Those are the fundamental issues we need to question. I think I told you, South Africa is the only country that seems to have 22% of its trade emanating from African countries, including what you saw in Nigeria. Now, the question is, how do we change that to make South Africa trade with Africa be 50%, is faster, is cheaper, is no longer is shortest distance to communicate, and equally important, it will help. Of course, one can argue that some countries like Egypt, or we call it the Northern Africa, they may not be seen like we see it in Sub-Saharan Africa. But it's the high time Sub-Saharan Africa wake up to understand that if we can change the trade by using this intercontinental free trade, we're going to move from literally 15% of African trade among themselves to about 52%, and it will make a difference in the economies.
Doc, we've had this binational with Nigeria for a very long time. President of Nigeria comes to South Africa, there's all the gun salutes, and the military parade. The presidents get to inspect them, presidents speak, the other presidents speak, great speeches, but that is usually the end of it. Yeah? Not a lot happens. And many agreements would be signed, but no one, I've yet to come across someone who believes that people were able to move aggressively enough on the back of those agreements, or with or without those agreements, to actually get to the point where you believe we could be at or should be at.
Totally agree. I think I'll confess to you what I have always told you. In my dream world, I create jobs, and I set my target every now in my life. My target is another 100 jobs in the next 4 years. I'm getting close to that. I visit African countries literally, maybe 5 in every half an year. The trade between South Africa and the African continents is higher from South Africa towards those countries. Specifically, if you look at the flow of goods within Sub-Saharan Africa, there is always a trade surplus between South Africa and the rest. I don't understand whether it may be because we are high-tech mostly, and we have expensive goods, of course, because we are a higher economy than they are, and therefore the flow from them to us is easier than the flow from us to them. I'm using some basic economic here. But in the end, the structure of the South African economy, and this is with all due respect to conglomerate, the conglomerate in this continent need to start thinking we are better off in the continent than we are in Chicago or we are in London. If you look at the amount of companies that are listed among the top South African company in London, I'm not saying it's not happened, I didn't say it didn't happen. But I don't know whether there is a cost to that in terms of the opportunity of what could be had they invested in the continent. That's a question to be asked. But the other question is to ask the simple question. Is it in the interest of the conglomerate here not to, again, invest in the continent or think about the continent, but more than that, also the South African themselves to start traveling? I get tired, with respect, that we have the best beaches in the world, whether it's Mauritius, whether it's Mombasa, whether it's Dar es Salaam, whether you name it, whether it's in Namibia. But I think our South African brothers and sisters need to change the attitude of we coming to South Africa, those African, but let's also, South African, visit this country, because the money exchange in tourism, inter-tourism trade itself, leave alone anything else, will change some of this economic growth by a huge percentage. So we need to underscore. But then finally, and you gave me good time, is to ask the question, how do we change it? First, we need to break the economies into sectors, whether it is manufacturing, whether it's service, and we need to identify that which, A, have common trade relationship or demand among countries, and think about how do we grow it in the short, medium, and long term. Whether it's tourism, we address that. We come to agriculture, we address that. We come to manufacturing, we address that. And we come to IT, then we look at it that way. In my view, we can change around. It will not take 20 years or 5 years, but in 5 years, we can make a difference. What's the beauty? We have the best youth in the world.